Ever wonder how ancient cultures, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, could have come up with such similar ideas? Well, today we're going to dig into a really fascinating and pretty controversial theory that tried to solve that exact mystery.
I mean, really think about it for a second. You've got pyramids in Egypt, right? But then you have these incredible step temples in Central America and giant burial mounds in North America. These things look uncannily similar, but they were built by people who are worlds apart. So, what's the deal? Is it all just a massive coincidence?
About a century ago, a group of anthropologists said, no way, it's not a coincidence. Their big idea was that these things weren't invented over and over again. They believed the ideas actually traveled from a common source. So let's dive into their theory. It's called diffusionism.
Okay, so what is diffusionism at its core? It's the idea that most of the big inventions, we're talking agriculture, massive stone buildings, even religious ideas, they weren't just popping up independently all over the globe. Nope. The theory says they were invented in one or maybe a few key places and then spread outwards, passing from culture to culture, kind of like a ripple in a pond.
Now, this whole idea had a few different flavors, but the most extreme, the most out there version definitely came from the British school of diffusionism. Their theory was simple, it was bold, and, well, it was really controversial.
And their entire argument was built on one pretty bleak assumption, summed up perfectly by its main cheerleader, Grafton Elliott Smith. His take? By and large, human beings just aren't that creative. We're imitators, not innovators.
So Smith and his followers, they actually got the nickname Pan-Egyptians. They argued that basically every single important part of civilization, from sun worship to mummification to stone monuments, was invented exactly once, in ancient Egypt. And from there, they thought it just got carried around the world.
And Smith built his case by pointing to the Great Pyramids of Giza as the original blueprint. From there, he started connecting the dots. Those huge stone structures in England? Just clumsy copies. Mayan pyramids? You bet. Influenced by Egypt. He even saw echoes of Egyptian design in Japanese pagodas, Cambodian temples, and yep, even those American burial mounds. To him, it was all one big family tree of ideas with Egypt at the root.
But you can probably see some pretty major holes in this theory, right? I mean, for starters, it just writes off the ingenuity of countless people around the world. It completely ignores other incredible ancient civilizations and just focuses on physical stuff, all without any real hard proof that these ideas actually traveled across oceans.
Okay, so while that was going on, over in Germany, a different and let's say more nuanced version of diffusionism was starting to take shape. And these guys thought that everything from Egypt idea was just way too simple.
And here's the key difference. While the British school saw one single cultural Big Bang in Egypt, the German school suggested that there were actually several original centers of culture. Each of these centers invented and then spread its own unique package of traits.
Their main concept was called Kulturkreise, which I know is a mouthful. It just translates to culture circles. The idea was that these unique sets of cultural traits started in a few places and then spread out in waves, creating these distinct zones of influence around the world.
So, how could you possibly prove a connection between two cultures thousands of miles apart? Well, they came up with a pretty clever two-part method. First, you use the criterion of form. Basically, you look for similarities that aren't necessary for the object to work, like a very specific decorative pattern on a pot. If two cultures share that, it's probably not a coincidence. And second, the criterion of quantity. The more of these weird, non-essential similarities you find, the more certain you can be that these two cultures were in touch somehow.
A classic example of this came from an anthropologist named Friedrich Ratzel. He pointed out that the way bows and arrows were made in parts of Africa and Indonesia was shockingly similar, right down to the shape of the bow's shaft and the specific style of the feathers. For him, those little details that didn't affect function were the smoking gun, clear proof of diffusion.
All right, now let's hop across the Atlantic. Over in the United States, anthropologists were looking at these ideas and trying to make them more rigorous, more scientific. They wanted to focus on what they could actually map and observe right there on the ground.
See, the German school was really good at describing what they thought happened, these big culture circles spreading across the map. But they were always a bit fuzzy on the details. How did these things actually spread? And why? The American school really wanted to figure that part out.
So they developed a new tool, the culture area. Instead of looking at the whole world, they zoomed in on specific regions, like the Great Plains or the Pacific Northwest. And within those areas, they painstakingly mapped out all the shared cultural traits, from tools to social customs.
An anthropologist named Clark Whistler, for example, came up with these food areas. And when you look at his map, it just makes so much sense. The societies out on the Great Plains, their entire world revolved around the bison. Up on the Pacific coast, it was all about salmon, and this shared way of life naturally led to all sorts of other shared cultural traits.
This kind of detailed mapping led Whistler to a really sharp insight he called the age area principle. Let's go back to that ripple in a pond analogy. When you drop a stone, that first ripple is the one that travels the farthest, right? Whistler argued that the same thing happens with culture. The traits that are most widespread in a culture area, they're probably the oldest because they've had the most time to spread out from the center.
And then another key figure, A.L. Kruber, he took this whole idea and basically put it on steroids. He and his students created these enormous, systematic checklists, they called them culture element lists, to compare hundreds and hundreds of specific traits. This allowed them to map the boundaries of these culture areas with a ton more precision.
So, okay, we've seen this theory evolve from this wild idea about Egypt to these complex circles and super detailed regional maps. But what's the big takeaway here? Why do these old and, let's be honest, often pretty flawed theories still matter today?
Well, as you can see, there was a clear progression. The idea starts off as this huge, sweeping generalization. Then it gets more complex and nuanced with the Germans. And finally, it becomes much more grounded in actual, observable evidence with the Americans. It's a really clear evolution in how we think about this stuff.
And in the end, while pretty much no anthropologist today would seriously argue that all civilization came from Egypt, diffusionism was a game changer for its time. It was a crucial first step. It forced people to stop seeing cultures as these isolated little islands and to start thinking seriously about contact, about migration, and about the giant, messy, complicated web of influence that connects all of us.
And that brings us to a final thought, right back to today. The tools have changed for sure. We've gone from ancient migrations to fiber optic cables. But that core question is still totally relevant. In our world of viral videos, memes, and global trends, how is culture diffusing right now? What are our modern culture circles? And what's sitting at the center? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.